Behind the Biennale.
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 An artist's duty, as far as I'm concerned, is to reflect the times.
What I do know is if there is a country without art, that's not a country I want to live in.
Hi there, and welcome to Behind the Biennale, a podcast that picks the brains of some of the most brilliant, creative minds involved with Niren, Sydney Biennale 2020. This podcast is created and produced on the stolen lands and waters of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and future. Sovereignty was never ceded. All Behind the Biennale conversations take place on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Namila Benson, and I am going to be tapping into the genius of some of the brightest minds to tackle the big questions and conversations in the art world today. It's very interesting times facing the international arts community and the world in general right now, because we have entered a global pandemic with coronavirus, and the world is pretty much bunkering down and practicing physical distancing and self-isolation. Our museums and galleries are closing indefinitely, arts events are being cancelled. So what does that mean for this 2020 Sydney Biennale? Well, I have the perfect first guest to answer that question. Brook Andrew is someone I met many years ago when I used to do TV in another lifetime, and I did a story on his work Jumping Castle War Memorial, a work that created a lot of discomfort and forced art lovers to grapple with some big ethical questions. But such is the nature of Brook's work. You're forced to think. That work was part of the 17th Sydney Biennale, and fast forward a decade later, Brook Andrew is now the artistic director of the 22nd Sydney Biennale, which he's renamed Niren, meaning edge in his Wiradjuri language. Many times when I mention Brook's name, people are astounded I know him, and I'm astounded. They're astounded because, yes, I recognise he's a big deal in the international arts world, but I'm going to let you in on a little secret. For an artist of Brook's calibre, he's extremely down-to-earth and, lovely, in fact, and he'll happily gasbag to anyone about anything to do with art, politics and the human condition. Being such an accomplished artist, I really didn't know where to begin with Brook's bio. So instead, I asked him to introduce himself to you, the Behind the Biennale listener, and let our conversation flow on from there. So make yourselves a cuppa, get comfy and meet Brook Andrew, Artistic Director of Niren 2020.
So I'm an artist. My name is Brook Andrew. I'm a Wiradjuri Celtic man from Australia, and I'm also I want to say scholar actually, because it's a funny thing, the word scholar, but it's kind of fun because I'm doing my PhD at Oxford, yet I'm working close with communities here back home, and I'm just really passionate about restitution or repatriation and kind of histories that deserve more airplay so we can do healing, out of the trauma in which a lot of our communities have come from. But within my arts practice, I'm really lucky because I get to collaborate a lot with different folk, and that's my current gig at the moment with the Artistic Director of the Biennale of Sydney.
So as artistic director, how would you sum up what you wanted your aim to be stepping into the 2020 Sydney Biennale?
Oh my God, that's such a big question. I think that when I was asked to be Artistic Director of the Biennale of Sydney, I just thought it was one incredible opportunity to connect with people all over the world whose practices and ideas aren't often part of the kind of centre of what art is, and if we look at it internationally, that's often a European kind of Western notion of what art is, and also the market. I mean, in saying that, it doesn't mean that there aren't artists there who, are successful within that market, but definitely their ideas are edgy, or they're kind of holding these responsibilities around, what it is that makes their practice urgent. So that's something that, I really wanted to focus on. I also wanted to focus on communities and art forms that are not necessarily seen or deemed as part of that dominant kind of narrative of what art is.
Under your leadership, Sydney Biennale is renamed Niren. Why Niren?
Well, Niren is a Wiradjuri word. It means edge. And, it was the Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019. I mean, there's so much work being done in regards to languages internationally, even Mainkiki in Hokkaido, who's Ainu, Indigenous Japanese. I mean, there's just so many folks around the world. And it also kind of pushes a very particular kind of philosophical premise as well. So to look at the world through Indigenous philosophies and ideas and way of being is something that's quite different to the kind of dominant, not only aesthetics, but like everyday lifetime and ceremonies, food preparation, like the way people communicate to each other. And so it's this kind of thing that I really wanted to bring to the forefront.
I want to extend on that because I'm wondering what it is about the commonality with the artists that you've handpicked to be involved in Niren. So how would you sum up, Brook, what defines a Niren artist?
Oh, wow. That's such a great question. I mean, I think it's really about how they all kind of connect to each other. One amazing thing that occurred, and we were very lucky to open for the first couple of weeks of the Biennale, is people's made these really special connections to each other that will go on. So it's really kind of created a family. And we've had two quite big press releases over the last year and a half as well, and that also brought people together from all over the world, and the way in which that ceremony has also been part of that. So I think that the way in which that artists kind of relate to space as well as to each other, a lot of the artists I was kind of interested in their own relationships to their own histories and their own cultures, but also their kind of passion and their kind of humble intimacy to wanting, kind of hidden histories, but also generosity as well, and kind of issues around sovereignty and healing, even though that some of the issues are really tough. And so I think there's a whole bunch of different things that kind of coalesce to kind of cuddle each other in a way.
We'll get into those bigger issues in a moment, but I guess I wanted to ask you what defines a Niren artist, because what I have always loved about your approach to creativity is your willingness to invite in folks who aren't considered traditional artists. And I guess I include myself in that, because this is a very basic but also quite a complex idea of what and who you consider to be an artist. Because I look at, say, myself, I look at someone, say, like Kylie Kwong, and with cooking. And yes, there's a level of creativity in what I do with audio and what she does with food. But how do you define what an artist is?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that how I define what an artist is definitely by the creative gesture. I mean, we're all artists per se, and I think that that's one thing that's been the problem with, as I've mentioned, the European Western kind of art market and concept of art, is that it often cuts off creativity very prematurely, and it's very fluid, the way in which that song can activate food or performance or radio or vibration in the body. And these are all the things that I'm really connected to. There's a generosity there. There's a kind of a spirit of a connectivity. So that what I was talking about before, about how people kind of come together in communities or the kind of different expressions that they have, it's not something that's bound by an aesthetic choice that's shown on a wall only. I mean, of course, that's important, like with the Adrift Lab and Lucian, who's work is very much about drawing an extinct species every day and then rubbing it off. I mean, there's a whole lot of effort and connection to scientists that are involved in that practice. So that really is what would define a NIRIN artist.
As artistic director, I'm wondering how on earth you begin the extraordinary task of finding global creatives to engage their disciplines to speak to what you'd envision for NIRIN, because there are some big things that you've mentioned so far in this conversation that I guess kind of binds or connects us as an arts community.
I mean, I think that, you have to start with a list of names because it's how it's definitely done. But then kind of after realising that the list of names, most of them had already been in a Sydney Biennale before, I needed quickly to find a different approach. And so I decided to, really kind of explore places and spaces that I felt like there was an affiliation with the ideas of NIRIN, so around sovereignty, for example. And so Haiti was one of the first places that I went to. In fact, it was. And I was very lucky to be, connected to Leah Gordon, who runs the Ghetto Biennale with Ray Chen. And I visited Haiti with them, and they showed me around the different arts communities. I mean, Haiti has a very special place in the world because it was the first, communities that revolted against slavery and are still being punished today for their revolt. And their artists are extraordinary. And so that's really the kind of space that I started from. And then they introduced me to other people. And then I followed people to Brazil. And then, I was at MUSPA in Brazil, which is one of the contemporary art museums there, and on a panel called Indigenous Histories. And then I met, Dennis and Benoit, who gave this extraordinary performance that was a protest, about the lack of Indigenous people in museums and exhibitions. And then so it was, about this kind of rolling story of that person introduced me to this person. And then I met people in an artist-run space in Sao Paulo. And so then Mauro Brazil and her collaborator Anna became, part of the Biennale. And a lot of these people had not been in Biennales before.
You mentioned sovereignty before, and that is such a huge global topic at the moment for so many communities and cultures. And I'm wondering, Brook, with artists who are stepping onto Gadigal land, particularly internationals, what do you tell them about the genocidal history of the place they'll be on, and I guess the conversations around sovereignty within that?
It's really interesting because Arthur Jaff has been to Australia a few times now, and he's a filmmaker and he's quite well known for not only films but music videos he's made, and also he won the Golden Lion at the last Venice Biennale for his video work, the White Album. And he's had this fascination with Aboriginal culture, specifically Papagnatula, the kind of very famous dot paintings, etc. But it took him 3 or 4 visits to Australia to understand really what Australia is about, because like other nations, we are subjected to stereotypes or invisibilities, like Mainkiki and the Ainu of Hokkaido in Japan, those Indigenous people. And, I can tell people about these histories and stories, but it's not until people actually come and visit and connect and want to connect that people unpack the kind of complexities and realize that in some ways, for many people, it mirrors their own situations. So, for example, in Africa and in South Africa, the South African artist, she really wanted to connect with Indigenous women and stories and ceremonies about activating, their space as well. So, it was a combination of people visiting and unpacking it for themselves, because I think it's for me or anyone else, if you went to, Papua New Guinea or somewhere else, people don't actually understand the complexity of those nations, until you actually visit there or you've had close contact with people.
It's such a true thing that you say right there. I think you've really clocked onto something quite key as well, in that we go about navigating and living our lives on this land day to day. But it's funny how a lot of the bigger and broader conversations get crystallised when you've got internationals who visit here. And there was one particular artist that I was speaking to who's involved with the Biennale with Niren, and they were talking about how they really wanted to respond to and partake in Acknowledgement of Country, but didn't feel it was their right. And being an artist of colour, that added another complexity, I guess, to how they were considering and mulling over what role they can play, with sort of extending that they understand the genocidal history of this nation, and they want to appeal to the Black community, you know, here in Australia, but feeling that they didn't quite have the right to do it. But it was interesting watching this artist when they were engaging in other conversations with Australian-based artists, and just how closely they would watch during Acknowledgement of Country, because you could see the brain was ticking over. There were a lot of considerations and a certain solemnness, I guess, with knowing that that they're sitting amongst other settlers and considering their place within that as well. So I'm wondering, how do internationals, or how have internationals been responding around the beautiful process of Acknowledgement of Country?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone can do an acknowledgement of country. You can just walk into a cafe and sit down and say to yourself quietly, or to your friends, I acknowledge, the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, or, if you're in Melbourne, anywhere, it doesn't matter where you are. It's not something that you need special permission to do. In fact, it's something that every international person should do, even if they're going to Italy and to Rome. Just say, well, I acknowledge the locals here.
Isn't it funny, though, that this artist was like, no, but can you imagine? And what they had said was, can you imagine I'm a Black person and I'm visiting a Black land that is dominated by white narratives who control stories of this nation and revision history. And they were like, the way I don't feel it's my right to be able, and I mean, there were others who were present who said, no, actually you can do acknowledgement, but they're like, no, as an international, I don't feel that it's my place to step in.
Yeah.
And it felt very layered for them and quite complex about what their role is within that, and considering things like sovereignty, like settlement, like genocide, etc.
Well, that's their choice, but I think that for me, I think it's just acknowledging what's around you. So if you go to a field and you acknowledge, the tree there and the rocks. I mean, this is something that Alicura, the Mapuche poet, who, has two actually many things, many poems, but two representations, in Niren. One is at the facade of the Art Gallery in New South Wales, a beautiful poem, and one is on an LED strip that's been, many poems have been translated both into Spanish but also into Doric language. And it's just about acknowledgement, and I think that everyone deals with that in their own way. When I was in Haiti, I was led around, by locals, and I acknowledged everyone there. But when we're talking about a welcome to country, of course, this is done by traditional owners or people who have the permission from traditional to do a welcome to country. That's a very different ceremony, and it often includes a cleansing. But there are other artists who collaborated with locals, like, for example, Takalik Partridge, who's an Inuit, spoken word artist and also beadwork artist, and worked very closely with Karina Moreno, who is a Doric woman, linguist, assists with directions around connecting to country and ceremony. But I think the powerful thing about Niren is that is very much First Nations driven, the kind of narratives, the stories around safe places as well, to be able to say. Especially when lateral violence can be an issue within our communities, and the way in which that we go to other spaces and kind of understand that colonialism has taken its toll, and which includes trauma and intergenerational trauma. But I think we also have to remember that it's important to feel some sense of relief and joy and healing around ceremony. And I've spoken to Uncle Brendan from the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council, who did many of the smoking ceremonies, and he was just telling me how important it is for all people to acknowledge where they are, but to also feel like they can be healed as well. And so I think this is something that's very much kind of embedded within the concept of NIRIN right from the beginning.
And you're bringing in artists from all around the world. And I guess I want to broaden this conversation a little bit, because when it comes to democracies and dictatorships around the world and throughout time, why do you think, Brook, that the fear of artists is so prevalent? And we see it in different ways, even in democracies, for instance, where funding is cut, or, different arts bodies are cut. It's just, there's ways where, I guess, structures and systems try to systematically take away the power of artists. And I'm wondering, how you would sum up where this fear comes from.
Yeah, I think maybe if I can come from it from the angle of NIRIN being the first Indigenous-led, artist-led Biennale. And that's actually a bit of a game changer for funding bodies, but also for the Biennale as a not-for-profit organisation, where it's actually partnered with, for example, the Open Society branch of New York that really does support not just artists, but people from all different places and spaces that need this desperate support to be visible, to be alive. And so I think that the ways in which the Biennale is actually engaged with them, but also with the federal government, with the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Cam Wyatt, like they haven't given money to the Biennale before. So I think that, if anything, this kind of Biennale has attracted a lot of support from organisations, let it be government or not, that see the urgency of these, the subjects that we're dealing with. And sure, absolutely, I think that there is a lot of, fear around the way in which Indigenous artists, but not just Indigenous artists, but other artists who are involved in this Biennale, whose works are around tension or around, ceremony or, about working together. These are things that are very much outside of the kind of often economically driven art market that are there for mainly the idea of the artist as genius, that are often European men. And so I think that it's a complicated thing that you've asked me, because I think that NIRIN's actually been a bit of a game changer for that. This is the first time the Australia Council has given so much funding to Australian artists. Also the Canadian Council, also, Creative New Zealand as well. And so I think that people have a thirst around these urgent issues, which also include the environment. People are thirsty for it. And I think that in the past, and ongoing for other artists, and the kind of cutting of funds, absolutely true what you're saying. But I think that that's one really interesting thing about this Biennale, is that it's been able to kind of bring together into focus, what does that mean? And what are the kind of artworks? Some of the media have commented on how not many artists in this Biennale are famous. Who are they? Do we know them? And it's actually very kind of it kind of exposes their own limited view on what is art in the world today, because clearly many of these artists are actually quite famous in their own communities and in their own countries.
It's an interesting thing that you're saying, because also, to exactly as you say, it's a big revelation as to those who are critiquing the names involved in NIRIN. But it's also them making a very big statement on who is worthy of having a seat at the table.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. But you know what? They don't have the power.
No, and I love hearing what you're saying, because I feel like you're speaking to a much needed shift that has been happening, and we see it in different ways right across many societies. And I love that particularly many non-Anglo arts practitioners have spoken for years about decolonising and the necessity of decolonising the arts sphere, particularly museums around the world. For yourself, Brook, what should decolonising in an arts institution look like in 2020? You're definitely doing it through NIRIN, but what about in those traditional art spaces?
You know, it's really interesting. I do have to say that the term decolonising is very powerful and it comes from different places, but I don't think that it's a word that I would use anymore. And the reason why is because, it became famous. I mean, he didn't invent it, but, the Argentinian Walter Manolo really made it quite famous. But for me, it's more around issues of sovereignty and issues of self-representation, and also around restitution and repatriation, not only of cultural objects and human remains from museums, but also our language, our body, how we are in the world, how we want to activate ourselves in the world. And I just find that, decolonial, processes aren't so clear anymore, and they're a bit murky, especially for myself and other Indigenous people I've spoken to in Canada and in Australia and some other nations. I think that the terminologies are shifting and have shifted because it really doesn't represent what our goal is. And I think that what our goal is really represents it on our own terms. And I think that, the decolonial, of course, can be used in powerful ways to, for example, for European museums themselves as non-Indigenous, non-people of colour who are, wanting to strive ahead to decolonise their museum. What they're actually talking about there is that they're saying that they want to look at their own histories and they want to insert women in there, people of colour in there, colonial histories in there, where their money comes from in there. And I think that is a very kind of different pathway to, for example, what restitution and repatriation looks like and the kind of, voices that are coming out in NIRIN.
So when it comes to restitution and repatriation, even revisioned histories, what do you think is the key to starting that process in a meaningful way?
It's really such an interesting question, and so, for example, in there and there are little moments that I call powerful objects, and these are objects from different museums, internationally and locally, and also archives and collections that are kind of nuanced to kind of collaborate or connect with, some of the, I suppose, themes that the artists have got. And one of them is the Bernard Luthi kind of collection of archives. He's a Swiss artist that was very much involved in the Magicians de la Terre exhibition at the Pompidou, and that was a kind of a groundbreaking exhibition for Europeans because it included also non-European artists. And that in itself became quite a romantic view of, oh, look, we're including all of the blackfellas now, or the Indigenous people now. Where in actual fact, the reason why that I do have that archive at the Art Gallery of New South Wales sitting in that installation is because at first, the Aboriginal kind of communities and artists that were part of, the Magicians de la Terre actually didn't want to be part of that exhibition. They actually said, no, I don't want to be part of this because we're not magicians. And so it became a bit of a protest, and Bernard Luthi had to actually come out, had to visit those communities and say, oh, okay, it has to be Indigenous-led. And so that's what it gets back to. It gets back to whose narratives, who's in control of their own narratives. And that's what NIRIN's about. It's about being Indigenous-led. It's about it being, artist-led. And it's not about it being led by kind of, ideas or concepts, from a very particular, often small, small kind of mainstream art movement. But I think it's also important that we do talk about what is decolonial these days, because I think it's become a bit of a buzzword word, and people really need to understand that the decolonial is not something that can apply to everything. And it does apply to some people's lives and parts of those lives, but I actually don't think it fulfills something because it's become too much of the academy now. And I know that is a very academic thing to say, but it has, and I think that people are therefore forgetting that sovereignty, like actually getting access to land, is the most important thing, because if you don't have that, you don't have culture.
NIRIN 2020 kicked off, and then the world is hit by a global pandemic with COVID-19, and you have a bumper program with NIRIN. So I'm wondering how NIRIN is navigating what's happening in the world at this unprecedented time, Brook.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. Well, I mean, I think that, people are already saying that this Biennale is one of the most documented biennales in the history of biennales, because it is so community and artist and Indigenous led anyway, the kind of connections that have been formed. And so it's so important that, that our organisation, the Biennale of Sydney, honours artists' projects. So if they are spoken word, if they're performative, if they're lectures, however they manifest, they're going to be on podcasts, they're going to be, filmed and put online. And so that's something that, the Biennale team are working really hard on right now. And so over the next couple of weeks, of course this will take a little bit of time, but, it will be active. And I think that if anything, I'm really happy about this. It's like the best outcome anyway, even regardless if there's a pandemic or not, because it just means that a lot of these artists who are coming from those communities may not even get to see the physical show anyway, because it is connecting with artists and communities and collectives that are literally living on the edge of the so-called centre of the world. And of course that's their centre. But how is it that they can kind of experience these, these biennales, which I think biennales historically are problematic anyway, because they are often, created for very particular audiences.
I mean, I know the word has been extremely overused, but this is an unprecedented time with COVID-19, Brook. Tell me what you think the role of an artist is during this period.
It's such an interesting question. And I think that, even without this pandemic going on, there are artists who are involved in NIRIN, such as Dion Beasley, who, has muscular dystrophy and is profoundly deaf, but he's nationally recognised artist and illustrator for his drawings, inspired by his own life in Tennant Creek, in a remote Aboriginal community in Australia, and he does work collaboratively with Johanna Bell. And I think that it's really important to note that it was so important for him to give like the keynote called NIRIN Yarn for the Biennale of Sydney. And there are other artists who are impacted by movement or access issues. And so this, if anything, really helps us reflect on their lives and the kind of spaces that they're living within, creating within. And of course, for other artists who, their performance is so urgent, for example, the collective of Ailu, who are based in Madrid, who are a Central South American queer collective made up of activists and anthropologists and performers and art historians. They're on the hardcore front line of activism around trans and queer bodies. And for them, their activism is absolutely important because they need funding, and often they are not funded. And so there are a lot of different communities and collectives and artists who have always kind of worked in different ways anyway to the way in which that biennales operate. And so I think in some ways that's been a really fantastic experience for us all to learn from. And in saying that, of course, artists need to still get paid for their, for their presentations or their performances. And so being online is a way in which that, they can not only be with their own communities if they're self-isolating at the moment or not, or kind of, forming different relationships with each other through the whole kind of experience of NIRIN opening up, back, a few weeks ago. and for them to be able to talk about this online and to have it online.
Yeah, I think that's something that the global arts community is really considering. And it's interesting hearing from creatives who are either chronically ill or a part of the disability community, because something that they have always craved and needed is finally being addressed because it's impacting able-bodied folks. So, you mentioned a really interesting thing about access, not only being physical, but also around language. So, who did you want to reach initially before COVID-19 hit the world, when you were first asked to be artistic director? Is there a profile of a Niren person that you wanted to reach, Brooke?
Absolutely. I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, the deep west, out the base of the Blue Mountains, and I was born in the city and then went out to Blackett for a while near Mount Druitt. And, a lot of my family still live out that way. And Australia is a place of asylum right from the beginning. And so there are so many different communities and cultures and religions and foods and experiences. And I want all those people, I'm really ambitious. I want them to walk in and go, oh, I've never been to the MCA before, or I have been to the MCA before. But, oh my God, there's Aziz Hazara, who is an Indigenous Afghani, and his work is about, the kind of destruction of his community and the death of children through ISIS and the Taliban, and how that connects to real lived experiences of people in Australia today. I want to get down to the real grassroots. I want people to be able to walk in and go, okay, I'm so happy that Dion Beasley, and Joanna Bell gave that, that lecture, because I have that in my own family, or I am deaf myself. And so this is something that I think art should be about. And art's such a lazy word anyway to describe the kind of creative expressions. I mean, you yourself, being, a radio extraordinaire, with sound, with interdisciplinary practices around your own discipline, and I've invited you as an artist. And so how is it that you apply your skills, your passions to this as well? The same as you mentioned Kylie Kwong before. I think it's so important that people understand that she's not just a big famous, kind of celebrity chef. She's very kind of profoundly engaged in grassroots communities within, kind of gardens with Indigenous foods for like 10, 15 years now. And so I think that is really what it's about. It's about how is it that people from the community can come in and go, oh, that's where it all is all connected.
That's 100% true, because you kind of almost have to hand feed people as to why certain artists you've invited in fit in a particular context of something like Niren. And I think for many it might even be viewed as quite radical that you've gotten in non-traditional artists like myself. I mean, to be honest, I don't call myself an artist, but, the way I'm stepping in is sort of continuing the kind of work that you like doing, which is sort of tapping into global discourse and understanding what gets people out of bed in the morning and what keeps them awake at night, and how are they addressing those bigger and broader issues. But I'm wondering, Brooke, do you think, because I think of the name Niren, and I think, and you've explained, it means edge. Edge is periphery, and art is often seen as being on the periphery. Do you think there's still such a thing as radical art? And are there collectives or artists in Niren who you would say fall into this category?
I think it's all radical. I really do. I think.
Why do you say that?
Well, because I think that the people are deeply invested in an experience or an idea that they're digging for, and that they're wanting to shout at the top of their lungs because it drives them. They're so passionate. I just kind of think of Gina Athena Ulysses, who is, a Haitian American anthropologist, feminist, poet, performance artist, activist. She's quite extraordinary, and she's never been in a Biennale before. And I saw her give a spoken word piece in New York, and immediately I saw her on stage. It's like, you've got to be in Niren. Because Niren, the Aboriginal, the Wiradjuri word, it actually means like the edge of like a carving. So when you're carving something. So when I'm even thinking about the word Niren, I don't think about it as like an English translation. I think about it as something else. I think about it as the edge of a silhouette, or, that sounds quite romantic, that. But, I do really kind of experience it as something that is not bound up by Western values. And even for Gina herself, I mean, she's been to Australia 3 times now. She really wanted to connect with local community as well. The same with Teresa Margolis, the Mexican artist who came here and created an extraordinary installation where she went to the sites of murdered women recently in Australia and kind of went there with her collective and, her, volunteers from the National Art School, and soaked up the sites in water, and had the essence of those sites, powerful sites, and created an installation about the remembrance of those deaths of those women. There are kind of more intimate, quite confronting artworks like that, but, I think every work, I would have to say, is radical. I just think of also Mohamed Bourassa, who's the Algerian artist based in Paris, whose work is about looking at mimosa, or the wattle tree, and it appearing overseas and also in Algeria when he was growing up. But actually it's a form of colonialism because of the way in which eucalyptus trees were planted internationally, and how he kind of unpacks that. And he worked with, an Aboriginal and an Egyptian hip-hop artist to kind of create these soundscapes. And so there's this kind of urgency, I would say, as well, around a lot of the artworks.
Urgency is an important word, as is radical, which we've been talking about. I think what's often seen as radical as well, particularly in current times, is kindness. Like, we're living in this grave time of what I refer to as an empathy deficit. And I'm wondering how you navigate that when so many artists are sometimes fighting for scraps and we end up turning on each other. How do you navigate trying to still embed kindness in a time when things are hard for artists?
Yeah. I think that empathy is really important. But, I think that there's also the reality is, some people are affected by trauma, or this, the reality of jealousy. Let's face it. Every world, every creative world, there are complicated personalities as well. And so I think that sometimes they're not actually got anything to do with, cultural identity, outside of the self. Sometimes it can also be linked to a kind of a lateral violence, where people think they might know somebody or know something. In actual fact, it's not really the case. And I think that that's just the complexity of humanity. But not to get away from your question, I think it's very important. And, one thing that I really wanted to embed within NIRIN is healing. So, for example, Tony Albert's work, is very much connected to the Blacktown Native Institute and the work he's done around that site, being the first site of the removal of Aboriginal children in Australian history that a lot of people don't even know about, and the way in which that art installation is a space where people can, write notes to heal and then plant them, onto the site of the Native Institute or other places. And so this is kind of like a healing of trauma space. There are many, many other artists. There's even with Lola Amira, who I mentioned before, who creates this space where people stand on salt and hear the beautiful kind of music of her homelands in South Africa, and the way in which that it heals the body in space.
I think what I have found to be the most difficult, I guess, when your work and your practice is politicised by your community, whoever that community is. It's multiple communities really for every single person. Like, for instance, I guess I've received it from the Black community, but I've also received it from other intersectional feminists. I receive very harsh criticisms from Islander community, and it's not even that you are necessarily taking up too much space, but it's just this whole thing of either you're too much or you're not enough of this, that, and the other. And I guess for me, I'm constantly kind of trying to find this place of working out constructive, engaging approaches to address what has been said, but yeah, doing so in a way that does involve kindness. Have you been able to work that out, or like me, are you a work in progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just consistent with the kind of different spaces that we work within. So if I'm finding that if they're more Western bureaucratic, the kind of way in which that the system is built up is often around egos, it's often around a lot of attention, and that's just the way in which that system works, like capitalist systems.
Absolutely, and white supremacy. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the way in which that racialization occurs, the way in which that homophobia occurs, they're definitely built within certain systems, and it's people who don't stand up against that or are fearful of being seen as political or fearful of themselves even being attacked by a perpetrator of lateral violence or racism or homophobia. And that's something that I really pushed right from the beginning in NIRIN, is that it's a safe place. I didn't want to have something where, some artists or community people would be speaking about their work or in conversation, and then someone would stand up in the audience and scream at them. I find that that's not only disrespectful, but I don't think it's an Indigenous way of dealing with things. I think that there's a myth around that. And so I was very mindful of how it is that we create spaces that are safe. And even the word safe is a loaded term, because that means different things to different people, because you don't want to silence people either. But I think that there has to be a very healthy dose of respect. And the kind of artists that I've kind of chosen and worked with, or actually they chose me, really. I didn't choose them. They had to say no. There are very few artists, in NIRIN who were not switched on to that. And I think that's a blessing, really. Because if you went to the openings, and when people could, get within a few meters of each other, there was a real generosity of spirit. And I think we were just kind of lucky, and it shows through many of the works. But again, I think it doesn't necessarily resolve or solve things, but I'm hoping that it will point to the sort of work that does need to happen and occur.
What would you like the legacy of NIRIN to be?
Things need to change. I think that, the most tragic thing about, you talk about white supremacy, and we talk about the decolonial, and we know that they're much more than those things, because it's about complex positions of power, which is not only about intergenerational trauma and the removal of people's objects, and money and class. I mean, humanity is a bit of a mess, quite frankly. But one thing that biennales need to do is that they have to reflect on their own histories. And they come from the great expositions where colonial powers were basically raping and pillaging around the world. And people don't like to hear it, but it's the truth. And they're just coarse words to use, because I think when you're on the front line, or your families have been on the front line, it's deeper. And to remove those spurs means that sometimes the frustrations and the languages and the actions need to be a lot tougher. But I think that NIRIN's about getting that balance. But coming back to this kind of idea of biennales being the kind of grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of the great expositions is problematic, because it does set up very particular systems of how we see art, of how we see artists, and I don't think we can look at it like that anymore. It's been way overdue that it needs to change. I don't think I have a magical answer for it, but it definitely needs to be representative of many cultures, but not seen through the lens of primitivism or anthropology. And I think that in itself is a racist theory and action, and people need to start looking after each other.
Brook Andrew, Artistic Director of Sydney Biennale 2020, aka NIRIN. Thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Biennale.
Pleasure. Balia. I wish that everyone gets to see the physical aspect of NIRIN as well, but if they don't, that's okay. But I just really hope that whatever is in the power of the universe and all the goddesses around the world and the universe, that we will, create a much better space, and that includes the environment and our attitude towards animals and our connection with those other beings and spirits. And, the world that we know is much more than what we can see with any of our senses, if you have them. And, it's about many other dimensions and other spirits and the supernatural. And I think that the way in which that we have feelings and trusting in our vibrations and intuition, I think is very humbling. You just have to sit with yourself for a bit. And that's something that I've actually learned from a lot of the artists and the communities, and I want to thank them all.
Hope you enjoyed this first instalment in our series of the Behind the Biennale podcast, and I look forward to sharing another conversation with yet more creatives involved with NIRIN next time. You can find us on Spotify and your usual fave places where you listen to podcasts. We drop new episodes fortnightly. Make sure to stay abreast of NIRIN happenings by heading to the Sydney Biennale website and following them on all your socials. Behind the Biennale's technical producer is Nick Harrison. My name's Namila Benson. We look forward to your company again next time. See ya.